Welcome to Come Follow Me, week 21, where we cover Mosiah's chapters 18 through to 24. And Mosiah 18 is really interesting because it's the first mention of baptism in the Book of Mormon in the dictation sequence, but it also talks a little bit about Alma in ways that seem really unusual and something that is worth having a look at. And the first thing you come across is that Alma is privately teaching people. And this comes up both in verse 1 and in verse 3 because he doesn't want to be known to the king. And this is really interesting language, but also a fascinating story. And if we're talking about Noah being Joseph Smith Sr. and Alma being Joseph Smith, it seems that Joseph has had a change of heart. Abinadi has stirred with him and the idea that he needs to be more righteous, and he has to go about being more righteous in a innocuous, private kind of a way because he doesn't want his father to find out. And this makes a bit of sense because Joseph has, up until this point, supported his father against churches, and his mother and his siblings have gone to the Presbyterian church. And so the idea that Joseph has now had a religious conversion, this is a big deal. And he's got himself a secret hiding place, a place that he calls Mormon. And there's some really odd little specific things about this place, particularly that there's a thicket of small trees, that these are really interesting dynamics. We don't know where this is, but it must be really important to Joseph. And he seems to be gathering himself a little bit of a group, an idea that people who want to have a better life, that they want to support each other, bear each other's burdens, mourn with those that mourn, comfort those who are in need of comfort. This is really quite a different take. This is almost kind of revival language, and the idea that they're clapping their hands for joy, and this is the desire of our heart. Joseph is really understanding the idea of a covenant with God and baptism as an opportunity to be part of a communal group that supports each other. And he's also got a baptismal prayer, the idea that they've got authority from God, they're making a covenant to serve him, and that the Spirit of the Lord will be poured out. So there's no the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost at this point, of course, but now we have the introduction of baptism and the idea of making a covenant as part of getting baptized. And the other odd little thing is that you've got Alma and Helam, who's been introduced to us, and they're bearing each other in the water as they start this round of baptism. And he's calling this the Church of God or the Church of Christ. He's making a distinction there. And he's also baptizing with power and authority, which doesn't seem that he's got any of this, but he's taking on board that kind of Protestant understanding of the scriptures giving power. And this movement's going to ordain people and have them, preach nothing but repentance and faith. And the idea that there's not going to be any contention one with another, something that has really been lacking in his life up until this point, he's going to implement it. He's going to be in charge of it. And we see these double ups in the text, but they emphasize the idea that Sabbath is important and priests are ordained to labor with their hands, that one day in the week is set apart, that the priests are not to depend on the people for their support, and everybody should share. That's really important to take care of the needy and the naked. Verse 30 is interesting because he just reiterates this idea of Mormon several times in the text. And so somehow Mormon has got into his brain and he's just reciting it and he's naming everything for Mormon. And he's still worried that the king, Noah, or Joseph Smith Sr. is going to find out. And when the king does find out, he thinks that Alma, or Joseph Smith Jr., is working to undermine him in rebellion against him. And so this is really interesting language, the idea that Alma, or Joseph Smith Jr., is having this conflict with his father and he's going to have to split with him. Any of you that have seen The Princess Bride know what a great adventure story looks like. And in Mosiah chapter 19, we return to the land of Nephi to understand what's going to happen to King Noah and his kingdom, because we know that they're going to fall into bondage, but how is this going to come about? So we first learn that the forces of the king are reduced because they've been looking for Alma, and because they're not looking after the property, the Lamanites come upon the city. And we also understand that there's a person called Gideon who is enemies of the king, and he just wants to slay him because he's a terrible person. Gideon spares Noah's life, but the kingdom is destroyed, or at least it's taken over by the Lamanites. But the wives and the children plead with the Lamanites, and they are saved because essentially the Lamanites, have compassion on the women and the children. But they're carried back to the land of Nephi, and they're allowed to possess the land, but now they have to give up half of their gold and their silver as tribute and tax to the Lamanites. And Limhi, who's the son of Noah, who understands how wicked his father has been, is now the tributary king. And King Noah is put to death by his men because effectively he's just a terrible leader. And the priests of Noah flee into the wilderness. And the Lamanites make an oath to the people, and Limhi makes an oath with the king of the Lamanites to make sure that there is peace. And there's peace for another 2 years, and the Lamanites set guards around the people in order to make sure that they keep up their tribute. Now let's look at that same story from the perspective of the Smiths, as told by Lucy Mack in her biography in 1845. She says that while Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith Jr. were away on a treasure dig in Harmony, Pennsylvania, that there was a man who had been the builder who wanted to take over and purchase the land and basically turn the Smiths out. But they were saved by Lucy and her quick thinking in getting a Quaker neighbour to purchase the property so that she and the family wouldn't be turned out of the land. She pled to have the mortgage taken over by the Quaker neighbour, and also that she would then, pay tribute or rent to them. Hiram would then become the person who would be responsible for the property because Joseph Smith Sr. had become unreliable and nobody could count on him. The failed treasure dig in Harmony meant that people lost their confidence in Joseph Smith Sr. and he was no longer seen as this great person who could lead them, including the family who understood him as a wicked man who was kind of not really taking care of them. So a new agreement was made for the Smith family so they could stay in the land of Nephi, and they had peace for the next 2 years from 1825 through to 1827. Chapter 20 tells the story of the abduction of the Lamanite daughters by the priests of Noah and how that affects Limhi and his new kind of semi-stable peace in the land of Nephi. The wording here is really interesting. The idea that the priests of King Noah are ashamed and they don't want to go back because people will slay them. And so they're tarrying in the wilderness and they've seen the daughters of the Lamanites and they've watched them and they've come out and they've carried them away into the wilderness. And the odd thing is this kidnapping is not really described in this chapter as something terrible, but the results are terrible. Firstly, the Lamanites find their daughters are missing and they're angry and they send their armies to try and recover their daughters, and this causes a war. Limhi and his people fight miraculously. There's just a small number of them, but they're able to defeat a lot of Lamanites, and even though they just shouldn't be able to, and the wording here is really interesting too, the idea of fighting like dragons, fighting for their survival. And this is actually repeated in other places in the Book of Mormon, but here it's just so fascinating. The Lamanite king is captured, and we find out that the Lamanites have come up because of this injustice that they've felt about their daughters being abducted. Gideon, who seems to be the voice of reason, talks to the king and says, let's pacify this situation and come to some agreement with the king. And once the king understands the situation, he assures them that it's going to be okay. He'll advocate for them with the rest of the Lamanites in order to make it possible for there to be peace again. And the Lamanite army, when they see that Limhi and his people are defenseless and they put down their weapons of war, they have compassion and their peace is restored. Let's tell the story now from the Smith family point of view and Joseph Smith, because we have the records of the Hales family, particularly Isaac and his extended family, and they tell the same story. Joseph goes back to Harmony to take Emma as a wife, but Isaac Hales tells us that he rebuffs Joseph, tells him that he's a stranger, he doesn't like his profession, and to go away. Basically, Joseph just waits for him not to be there, and then he abducts Emma and takes her away into New York. Isaac Hales is distressed by this, and he sends his family up to try and find them, and they go through to New York and are pacified by the Smiths. Isaac's sons find that the Smiths are poor but happy, and Emma is okay, and so they drop the suit. But it's a big distress to them, and many of the Hales and the extended Hales family talk about just how much this was a really terrible thing for them. They really loved Emma. She was almost their favorite, and so when she was taken away from them, it was a huge thing for the family. And so that's how Joseph Smith wrote about the abduction of Emma into the Book of Mormon narrative, but he played it off into his alter ego, the priests of Noah, who were the wicked money diggers, rather than him as a righteous Alma. Mosiah 21 is just really a sad indictment on the plight of the people of Limhi in the land of Nephi. And basically things are hard. The Lamanites, they're not killing them, but it's miserable. You know, they're smiting them on the cheek, they're exercising authority, they're putting burdens on their back, they're driving them as they would a dumbass. It's just hard yakka. And there was no way that they could deliver themselves from out of their hands. And so you can imagine the Smith home under these conditions. The new mortgage arrangement, which means that they're now tenants. They can't get out. They've got nowhere to go. They've got no land. And people are murmuring because of how hard it is and complaining to Hiram, who's kind of in charge, what to do. But the good news is that they're humbling themselves, they're subjecting themselves to the bondage, they're submitting, and they're crying to the Lord. They're really repenting, they are suffering, and it's helping them change their attitudes. And we also learn that the Lord is hearing their cries, but is slow to remember them because they were slow in the first place. And interestingly, the people of Lehi, they keep to themselves quite a bit. And the king, or Hiram, as he's going out to take care of business, he's taking a guard with him. People are accosting him all over the place. And we have that same iteration from back in Mosiah chapter 8 about a small group of people that have gone north to look for salvation, really, and have come back with these 24 gold plates. And this really sounds like Joseph trying to improve the family fortunes by getting some treasure, bringing back these plates. But the treasure's no use to them for some reason, only that they're worried about who can translate it. And this is going to be Mosiah. So it really dovetails into the story of getting the gold plates. And so Limhi's real hope is on Mosiah having this gift of seeing that is going to enable the plates to be translated and give them this account. I mean, underneath the surface, of course, you can see that they're wanting this to be a money-making activity, that by the translation, by the book that comes forth, they're going to be able to relieve their suffering. And they're really mourning the loss that they've felt under King Noah, that his wickedness has really oppressed the family. And that really comes through in these texts. But they're sufficiently humble and they want to make a covenant with God. King Limhi's done it, and also many of the people of the household, of the Smith household. And they desire to be baptized, but they're concerned about authority and who's really got it. But they've made a commitment to God that they're willing to serve him. And so this is going to be the end. They're going to be saved. This is the beginning of good times. Chapter 22 focuses on the exodus of Limhi and his people from the land of Nephi through to Zarahemla, and it's really focused on the idea that there's a little bit of a democracy here. The king asks for people's input and the understanding that people can be saved if they put their heads together and follow God. We see this wording of women and children and flocks and herds and departing into the wilderness, which is going to be repeated many times, even in this short chapter. And Limhi is called for the voice of the people, and Gideon is offering advice to the king. And miraculously, there's a back pass with a secret entrance which allows them to escape as long as they can subdue the Lamanites by getting them drunk. So they discuss their plan and then they enact their plan. So there's a huge amount of repetition in these few verses, and then we find that they are arrived into Zarahemla and they become Mosiah's people and become his subjects. So Limhi gives up his kingdom. And Mosiah is really excited about the records that they've brought that he can now translate. Meanwhile, the Lamanite army has searched for them, but after 2 days can't find them, even though there's hundreds, maybe thousands of people who have travelled and should be easy to track. So what can we learn about this particular chapter? One of the things I think we can see is that it's very short because there's not a lot of detail, and that is because this event hasn't happened. Joseph is imagining it. He's imagining Hiram and his mum and dad and the other brothers and sisters coming to join him. But this hasn't happened. It doesn't happen. And so he's just really trying to understand what it might look like if it did happen. And so it's lacking in a lot of detail. And also, one of the things I think that's really interesting is this Gideon character that we see advising the king. And we know from the previous chapters that Gideon kind of fought against Noah, and now he's advising Hiram. And I suggest that this is probably Lucy Mack Smith. She's upset with her husband who's lost the family farm, but now that Hiram's in charge, she's trying to help him and advise him what to do to be the head of the house. And there's that repeated emphasis on the records, the 24 gold plates of the Jaredites, and bringing them to Mosiah. And this really dovetails with Joseph's own story about his golden plates. Mosiah chapter 23 is about Alma in the wilderness with his people in righteousness, but they also come under bondage by Amulon, one of the priests of Noah who has been picked up by the Lamanites. And this is a bit of a counter story, because up until this point, the idea is that people who are following Christ and God are going to be prospered in the land. But this doesn't happen for Alma, or at least he needs to be saved by God because he is righteous. So this story backtracks just a little bit and talks about how Alma left the kingdom of Noah and how he was warned by the Lord. And he's taken his people and they've fled 8 days in journey into the wilderness. And they've started to be industrious and build buildings. And they want Alma to be a king, but he's told them, look, you've had a bad experience with a king and actually you should preserve and enjoy your freedom. And this theme is going to be expanded later in Mosiah about the idea of kings, where Mosiah gives up the kingdom and people start to be ruled by judges. And in the same vein, you should be careful about who is leading you spiritually, that you should make sure that they're people of God, that they're keeping the commandments, and that everybody should love their neighbour and there shouldn't be any contention. So again, those same values that you see from Abinadi and King Benjamin. They prosper, but the Lord's going to bring them into bondage so that they can get a greater witness of him. The Lamanites who have been wandering in the wilderness find Alma and trick his people and pull them into bondage. And then we have this curious story of Amulon, who's one of the priests of Noah, who's abducted the Lamanite daughters and has used the Lamanite daughters in order to gain favour with the Lamanites. And this seems really odd and interesting unless you look at this from the perspective of Emma being the Lamanite daughter, suing for favour with her family on behalf of Joseph. Alma is now under the bondage of the Lamanites and ruled over by one of the priests of Noah. And so Helam seems like it's Bainbridge or Colesville, where he's away from the other groups of people, the Hales and the Smiths, but he's also under the same kind of condemnation with the money diggers. And this would seem consistent with the idea that Josiah stole, and perhaps even Joseph Knight are treasure diggers as well. Mosiah chapter 24 continues the story of Alma being under oppression to Amulon, one of the priests of Noah, and also to the Lamanites. And this is how they escape. A couple of things in the beginning of this chapter that are quite interesting. And the first is that the Lamanites have kings, and all of their kings are called Laman, which is also very odd because we've seen a number of Nephite kings up until this point in Mosiah being called by particular names. But in the replacement text, when Joseph may not remember what the kings' names are, he says that all the names of the kings are Nephi for the Nephites. So that's a really interesting comparison. And the other thing is that the people are then taught by Amulon and his brethren the language of the Nephites. And now that the Lamanites are literate, they are keeping records, they are increasing in riches, they're beginning to trade one with another. The idea that having some literacy means that you can increase in your ability, but it also says that their wickedness increases because of their access to this knowledge. And oddly, the Lamanites are loyal. They're only going to do wickedness to people who are not Lamanites, which is a bit of a problem because the Lamanites keep fleeing from them, like Limni and his people, and then now Alma and his people. There's not going to be anybody to steal from if there are no Nephites nearby. Amulon's children persecute Alma's children. And so the people of Alma feel very persecuted and under affliction. And so there's guards that are put upon them because they're praying, and so the guards tell them not to pray, and if they pray, they're being put to death, so they're praying in their hearts. And this is the idea, I guess, that there's this kind of secret communion that you can have with God, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's an outward sign of it. And God tells the people first that he's going to strengthen them in order so that they don't even feel the burdens that are placed upon them. And then God is going to miraculously save them, and it just gives them a night's warning that they're going to be taken care of, and causes a deep sleep to come on the Lamanites, and then the people just escape. And the first thing they do when they reach safety is that they thank God, and this is a really important part of giving thanks for your blessings and for your miracles. And the Lord gives them another miracle, which is they need to hurry up and leave and get to Zarahemla because the Lamanites are now chasing them. So this is a miraculous way of deliverance, and it's kind of a bit of a contrast between Limhi's more theocratical, democratized escape from the Lamanites and their captives. But these two stories are very much mirrors of each other. They're employing the same kind of rhetoric, even though there are slight differences.